Alrighty, welcome everybody here in the room as everybody gets their food and gets their seat, and everybody online. Thanks for being here for our latest Center for Asian Democracy talk here at the University of Louisville. My name is Dave Buckley. I'm the director of CAD here, and we are so glad to have Sarah Khan here to talk with us about gender and politics in Pakistan, and broader perspectives actually, because it's a research agenda that impacts so many of the regions that many of our faculty study. I'll just briefly introduce Sarah, and then we'll jump right in. Sarah Khan is assistant professor in the Department of Politics, Governance, and Economics at the School of International Service at American University. She has previously served as assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale University, where I believe she also served as a postdoctoral fellow before that, and completed her PhD at Columbia. She is a member of the Empirical Research on Gender and Evidence in Governance and Politics Research Networks. And in Pakistan, she's an associate fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, and a fellow at the Mahbub al-Haq Research Center. Her research interests lie at the intersection of gender, development, and comparative politics, as you'll hear about. She's published widely, including in the American Political Science Review on these topics, and we're thrilled to have her here today. So, Sarah, thanks so much.
For the generous introduction, and thank you to the Center for Asian Democracy and for coming out today for this talk. So the talk today is titled Norms and Gender Inequality, Limits to Change in Pakistan. And just to give you a little bit of background on what I'm trying to do in, as Dave alluded to, this broader project, my work in general involves field experiments that include collaborations with NGO and government partners to evaluate the effectiveness of policy interventions that are aimed generally at reducing some aspect of quote-unquote gender inequality. And the context in which, I do this work is Pakistan, which ranks 145th out of 146 countries on the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index. Now, this index takes a parity approach to measuring gender inequality. So, the gender inequality is in the title of this talk. There's lots of ways to define, conceptualize, and measure it. This gender gap index takes this parity approach, which means that it measures differences in outcomes for men and women in several different domains, including economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. And then these indicators that are included in this index and several others are often used to motivate the design of policy interventions and also to measure this change. And so within the context of these field experiments, I am working on evaluating if it's often along the lines of indicators. This project is an attempt to synthesize across those different where of the work evaluate effectiveness along these indicators, which, as Sally Mary really nicely puts it, these quantifiable ways of assessing or comparing characteristics among groups, organizations, or nations. Which of gender norms that are often not reflected in these indicators. How do they not change, and how are they sometimes even reinforced in the process of these interventions? And one of the measures along which gender parity is often calculated on the political side is in rates of voter turnout. And so women's voter turnout being the proportion of women registered to vote their ballot on election day. And so that's an example of one of the indicators used to measure women's political empowerment, the gender gap in voter turnout, the difference between men and women's turnout, so this idea of parity in turnout, for gap. So when I'm talking about the norms that go unchanged, interventions reinforced, I want to start by just of what I'm thinking about when I use that. So Christina talks about social norms as informal rules of behavior. With these informal rules is rooted as well as normative expectations. So what individuals kind of second order belief, appropriate behavior. And then gender norms specifically are these informal, very highly across context, and local level, these norms vary quite a bit. And when it comes to thinking, the way norms, what we think of large scale social upheavals or shocks, these are things that can transform norms. Interventions where, I study but then there's a second way in which I think interventions do also interact with norms, even if they don't explicitly change them, that structural changes, upheavals, and shocks may do. And that is that they may target a particular indicator like women's turnout, may achieve change in that, but at the same time leave some underlying norms unchanged or even inadvertently reinforced. So in this talk, I'm going to draw on experiments that I've conducted in Pakistan that study two different interventions. The first of these is intervention conducted by a civil society organization, a non-governmental civil society organization, to increase women's voter turnout in the 2018 national election in Pakistan. The paper from this is co-authored with Ali Chimash, Moment, and Asad Liaq, and this is a published paper. And then the second intervention in the community policing intervention, improve police responsiveness to citizens, and this draws on work that is co-authored with Jake Shapiro and Esin Faruqi. So I'm going to start with intervention around voter turnout. And before I intervention, just to give a little bit of context on how this became a target up to the so in 2013, after Pakistan democracy to have and so in the lead up to 2018 elections, there was for the first time ample time to kind of plan for these elections in a way that there hadn't been in Pakistan. A number of society organizations raised attention and awareness around the low rates of women's voter registration as well as voter turnout. And so in the 2017 Election Act, there was actually a mandate for the Election Commission to start publishing sex disaggregated data on voter turnout. And so the first way in which an indicator becomes a target is when it starts to be systematically measured in that way. And so, in the lead up to this intervention, there's a concerted effort by the state to start measuring women's voter turnout. And of course, then that was tied to a lot of development funding for interventions to improve on women's voter registration as well as turnout. The NGO that we worked with in this project had actually been working in the political landscape for a long time and done voter education campaigns that were targeted to women. And so there was a history of working on this, but then kind of a renewed enthusiasm, streams of funding, and general interest in working on this particular area. So the question that we sort of asked as part of this broader study was, what explains and what works to close the large and persistent gender gap in political participation along voter turnout lines in Pakistan? So in 2018, 11 million fewer women than men voted. And that reflects both a gap in voter registration and also in voter turnout. In our analysis of the 2018 sex disaggregated turnout data, we uncovered an interesting pattern whereby the gender gap in voter turnout is actually the largest in Pakistan's large metropolitan cities. And this is a pattern that holds across Pakistan's 4 different provinces, which have very different political characteristics and also vary along dimensions of gender equality and gender norms. And cities are also places where norms around women's participation in public environments is more permissive, or at least, it's thought to be more permissive than in rural areas. So this was kind of a puzzling pattern, and I'm going to bookend it for now and just say that this sort of motivated our focus on the city of Lahore within the Punjab province. And so in this study, we worked in Lahore, which is Pakistan's second largest city, and worked in 500 wards, urban wards, across 7 parliamentary constituencies. We conducted a survey in 2,500 households, where a man and a woman in each of those randomly selected households was surveyed both before and after the election. And right after the election, we measured turnout through this visual observation of an indelible ink mark that is made on the thumbs of voters when they go to cast their vote in at the polling station. And so that measurement of turnout took place in the days on election day and in the days right after. And there's an interesting gendered aspect to this as well, is that we heard that mark for women tends to wash off faster because they're doing a lot more of the washing of dishes and clothes. And so the urgency in getting this data the few days after the election was all the more pronounced for getting it for women. So in terms of designing an intervention to increase women's turnout in Lahore, the review that we conducted of existing campaigns or past campaigns around encouraging women to vote generally targeted women. And the assumption behind these was that the constraints to women's voting, whether it be lower resources, lower levels of engagement, were at the level of individual women voters. And so if we could solve this for women, that should improve women's turnout. And this was in conflict with some of what we know about this setting, where male members of households act as what we call in the paper, quote, everyday gatekeepers of women's participation in public life. So women's decisions to leave the house for any reason are often negotiated with male members of the household. So in that household survey done before the election, we found that 60% of surveyed adult women, compared to 16% of men, reported that they had to seek someone's permission to leave the home. Related to this, theories of political participation that emphasize the role of resources typically conceptualize those resources as held by individuals. But in this context, we also noticed that men controlled resources that were necessary for women's participation. This included means of transport, so how to get to the polling station, but also access to information and time. With the means of transport, 92% of the surveyed households in our sample owned a motorbike, but women did not really have control or access over that resource. So data from the excise department in Punjab revealed that 95% of all motorbikes in Lahore were owned by men. And, just visuals on the street, you'll see women on motorbikes, often with men driving them, but it's much rarer to see women individually owning or riding these motorbikes, which are a very common mode of transport, of private transport. And then along access to information and time, I don't have the numbers up here, but we also found that women were a lot more likely than men to learn about political issues from the men in their households. For men, the sources of information were a lot more diverse. So they learned from other men in the household, but they also discussed politics with neighbors and friends. So in this field experiment and in the evaluation of different campaigns, we asked two related questions. First, whether a quote-unquote norms-neutral model, one that only targets women and essentially the status quo of how these campaigns take place, is that one that fails to shift women's turnout? And relatedly, can an intervention that actually accounts for these norms of everyday gatekeeping, that what we're calling here a norms-aware model, can that sort of voter mobilization campaign increase women's turnout? So what do these models actually look like? So in this study, we randomly assigned households in coordination with the civil society organization to receive one of the following versions of a canvassing campaign in the lead up to the 2018 elections. A fourth of the households were designated to have no visit from a canvasser. A fourth of the households received a visit that was targeted to women and conducted by a female canvasser. Another fourth of the households received a visit by a male canvasser that was targeted to male members of the household. That's what we're calling the norms-aware version of the intervention that recognizes that men are in this everyday gatekeeping role and it's necessary to engage them. And then a fourth of the household received both of these, so two visits, one of each type. The components of these visits included the canvasser who was affiliated with the civil society organization, giving a non-partisan introduction, and the Election Commission of Pakistan had also given letters of introduction to certify that these were non-partisan. This was a non-partisan canvassing campaign. It included this 5-minute video linking electoral participation to outcomes around development and service delivery, so emphasizing that votes can be used to hold politicians accountable. There was an information leaflet with, which I have a picture of here, which shows the process of how to vote, what number to text to find out where your polling station is, as well as a mock ballot activity to actually take people through the motions of casting their ballot on election day. And the predictions of these two models of campaigns were that if we think that it's really these individual level factors that constrain women's participation, then we should expect turnout to increase when we canvass women. But if these male gatekeeping norms are really what are constraining women's participation, then we shouldn't see just canvassing women be effective. It would be necessary to canvass men. When we canvass both, that's when we would expect to kind of see positive effects if both of these factors are acting together. So what do we actually see? So what we find is pretty in line with those expectations. So we found that the first model of intervention, which targeted women, didn't result in any changes in women's turnout. The second version, which targeted only men, increased women's turnout in those households by 5 percentage points. And then the model that targeted both, so the households that received 2 visits, increased women's turnout by 8 percentage points. So this joint visit was more effective by 3 percentage points, but that difference was not statistically significant. And so this is important because what we can infer from this is that targeting men in this context was necessary to achieve changes in women's participation. And if you double the effort and target both men and women, that doesn't lead to significant enough gains that would justify the costs, essentially double the costs of targeting both men and women. So along with turnout, we also collected survey data on a number of other indicators related to political and electoral participation specifically. And so what we saw on those indicators, which were about political knowledge, interest, a sense of self-efficacy, views about restrictions and mobility in the household, we didn't see any change from any of the versions of the intervention on these outcomes. Where we did see change from the survey was in both women's responses and men's responses on whether men helped women vote in some way on election day. And this included especially by sharing transport on their motorbikes. And then we also saw both from women's and men's responses, a reported increase in discussion about the election among household members. So what we kind of gleaned from this is that the change was really happening because of these changes in men's behavior and discussion between men and women in the household, rather than changes along these individual attitudes or women's knowledge, interest, or sense of self-efficacy. So, as promised, I also want to talk about the limits of this and what didn't change. So I think first is a huge caveat that we think that this intervention where men were willing to take these actions to help women to vote likely happened because there was a pre-existing consensus that voting is something that's appropriate for women to do. So I know there's a lot here, and I'll walk you through it. So these are proportions of women in the darker bars and men in the lighter gray bars of our survey respondents who said that a particular activity was appropriate for women to do. So this is the proportion of responses for voting. So we see that 96% of women and 92% of men thought it was appropriate for women to vote. These numbers fall when we look at other political actions, even just discussing politics, right? And then when it comes to becoming a political worker with a party, we see a really dramatic decline with 57% of women and 36% of men agreeing that it's appropriate. For attending a political rally, it's incredibly low at 13 and 17%. Standing as a candidate, also low at 51% and 35%. What's also interesting about this pattern is that not only is there a high sense of appropriateness, it's also largely shared by men and women. And that's not the case, for example, for women becoming political workers or standing as candidates. where where there emerges this gap between men and women and the possibility for disagreement over this norm within the household. And so, in some ways, we're able to achieve change in men's behavior, in part because they think that it's the action that they're helping women to do is one that's appropriate for them to do. So it's not that they're somehow changing their attitudes about what is and isn't appropriate for women to do when it comes to political participation. Another thing that we didn't see a change in is, and I apologize, these bars are a little light to see, we asked a question that related to our earlier one about whether it's appropriate for women to vote. We also asked respondents when it was appropriate for men to stop women from voting. And here we see that that earlier consensus sort of breaks down in particular conditions. So actually 30% of women, and I'm sorry you can't see this very well, but 55% of men thought that it would be appropriate for men to stop women from voting if they were going to vote for a different candidate than men. And we sort of see this along different other scenarios. If the line at the polling station is expected to be long, if there's chances of fights at the polling station, if going out to vote is going to interfere with women's household duties. So that consensus on voting being appropriate for women to do was conditional on a certain number of things being met, right? And so that is something that is, of course, lost in an indicator or target of women's turnout, right? And so we're not able to get at this with the survey data, but I think, what we might be able to glean is that the change that we achieved was also within kind of these limits. And we did ask questions about women's perceived autonomy over their own vote, and we don't see that declined. And so I think what we can safely say that this isn't a case where men coerced women to go out and vote for the same candidate that they were voting for, but it might be a story of this change is achieved in households where perhaps men weren't thinking about sharing transport and other resources with women. They receive kind of a reminder or a nudge to do so, and they do so when it's not particularly contentious. So that's, sort of one plausible way to think about the limits of change in this study. So I'm going to switch gears now and move to the second study, which addresses police attitudes towards gender-based violence, and then at the end I'll kind of talk about the common themes across these two. So this study, the evaluation-related questions, in a similar vein of comparing a norms-neutral to a norms-aware intervention model, asks whether a norms-neutral community policing intervention in fact perpetuates women's exclusion and fails to change police attitudes. And on the flip side, can a different norms-aware model that accounts for norms, and in this case it's norms of gender segregation that we're concerned with, can this achieve greater inclusion of women and actually change police officers' attitudes? So I think in the first study it was the connection between the intervention and the target of change was quite clear. You want to increase women's turnout, and so there's campaigns that engage men and women around voter turnout. I think there's that's less clear here, where you might be asking why community policing in this context, right? And so the motivation behind the overall community policing intervention that we study was not specifically gender focused. And so the policy motivation behind community policing is usually about making police more responsive to citizens. This is a practice that is actually proliferated in a number of global South contexts, and there is really mixed evidence about its effectiveness. In fact, the study was part of a coordinated set of studies across 6 different countries, which finds null effects of community policing across contexts on outcomes of citizen trust in the police, police trust in citizens, and levels of crime reporting. But in our context, we had 2 models of the intervention that both revealed something about underlying gender norms and also interacted with gender norms in an interesting way. And so it's an opportunity to think about that same question. Now, some of the evidence around community policing shows that it can actually reinforce social divisions along racial, class, and ethnic lines. And this is from work in the US as well as in Brazil. And one of the things that we do in this study that hasn't been explored as much with community policing is how it could reinforce social divisions along gender lines. So as I said, this was part of a larger set of 6 coordinated studies in different sites, testing the effectiveness of different community policing practices that on whether they increase trust in citizens' trust in police, increase citizen-police cooperation, and reduce crime. And as I said, the coordinated set of studies showed a null effect on these outcomes. So these were kind of the community policing practices that were part of this intervention. I'm going to focus mostly on the town halls part of this, which was the major part of the intervention implemented in Pakistan, where where community policing teams held open community meetings with citizens where they could come and share their concerns, and officers could describe what it is that the police can do. So the context here in terms of norms that is of interest is that there's pretty strong informal norms of physical sex-based segregation in public space in Pakistan. I point out that these are de facto norms because it's not the case that the segregation is legally mandated, for instance, in the workplace in Pakistan. But this is slightly old data, but it's the only one. It's the only survey I know that has asked this question about whether different people would favor making segregation the law, and 85% of Pakistanis in this Pew survey said that they favored making segregation the law in the workplace. And this speaks to kind of how informal norms might operate, right? And so if there is a sense that the majority of people around you would favor segregation, then there's an individual incentive to comply with physical sex-based segregation norms, even if they're informal. Sex-based segregation also manifests as occupational segregation, which is relevant for this intervention. So fewer than 2% of Pakistan's police force is women. And then within the police, it manifests as task-based segregation. So for those women that are in the police force, they spend their time on the job very differently than do men. And so this is data that we collected from our sample of police officers at N-Line who were in the study but not part of the community policing treatment. And so this gives us a sense of kind of how they spend their time absent this intervention. So we see that male police officers spend about half their time patrolling beats, sometime inside the police station. They spend time on investigative duties, on refreshment breaks, and then female police officers spend almost all of their time inside the police station. And so a lot of the work that they're doing is essentially office work rather than field investigative work. So what does this all mean for the implementation of a community policing intervention? So when this intervention was first rolled out as, quote unquote, this neutral model of community policing without any mandates for gender inclusive gender inclusive aspects, the community policing teams came to be composed of all male officers. Because the requirement for being on those teams was that if you had some experience in the field, you were favored for that role. And as I just showed you, the task-based segregation meant that that was the male officers. Second, these town halls, these community meetings that were announced widely to all community members that were open to all also became these de facto all-male spaces that were not attended by women. And that's a function of those norms of sex-based segregation in public space. And so absent kind of a consideration of these contextual norms, this community policing intervention of creating community policing teams that hold these town halls and then develop response plans sort of manifests as an intervention by men for men. This was the case for about 3 months and raised alarm. It's like, all right, there's no women in these community policing interventions. And so, yeah, Anirban, did you have a clarifying question? Oh, great question. Yeah, so it's police officers. So there's each community policing team has 2 or 3 police officers who are basically recruited from the police station to devote a portion of their time during this intervention period to holding these town halls and preparing community policing response plans. And then it's citizens who are attending those community forums that they conduct. And so a big thing that the officers do is convene these forums. Okay. So as I said, there are these 2 kind of components of the intervention, the forum and then the community policing team that conducts these forums. And in this neutral model, the acronym is CPOP, which is Citizen Problem Oriented Policing. And you have these open forums that are open on paper, and then you have these 2-member teams that are actually all male teams with 2 police officers. And then about 3 months into the intervention, in a subset of areas, there's this modified model of community policing that mandated women's inclusion. So along with this open forum, police officers were then asked to conduct an all-women's forum. And then in order to conduct that all-women's forum, you needed a female police officer, so these 3-member teams were constituted with 1 female constable from the police station recruited to the policing team. So this is just kind of showing you the design of the evaluation. So this took place in 108 police beats, where you have a third of each beats assigned to different conditions. 1 is control, where no intervention happens. A third is these CPOP beats, where you have all male teams and all male forums, and then CPOP-G, where you have women on the teams and in the forums. So I'm going to walk you through kind of what the outcomes looked like at these forums in terms of attendance and also what issues the citizens who attended brought up. So this figure just kind of visually shows what I spoke about earlier in terms of the composition of the forums. So in green you have the average attendance of men at these open forums, and then in orange you have the average attendance of women at these open forums. It's close to 0. There were a few women here and there that did attend. And then in CPOP-G, where you have these women's only forums, you see high attendance by men that continues. So it's not the case that when you introduce women's forums, men are upset about this and they back out and don't choose not to attend. That's not happening. They continue to attend. And we see substantial attendance by women, actually quite close to what men's attendance is in this condition in the all women's forums. And so, I mean, one way to summarize this is, if you create spaces for what is considered socially appropriate participation, women do take up those opportunities. And then in terms of the problems that were brought up, so in the open forums, which are these de facto all-male forums, the top issues were around theft, drug and alcohol abuse, municipal issues, encroachment, and so municipal issues and other issues were sort of issues that were beyond the gambit of the police to address. And so there was a way also that citizens used these forums as a general complaint box, right? And so I think here the context of Pakistan where you don't have the same formalized system of village political meetings, these forums were also an opportunity to raise broader grievances around governance. In the open forums in CPOP-G, where you also have just men attending, the distribution of issues looks very similar. In these women's-only forums, you see that women bring up harassment against women and domestic and child abuse. And so, I take this as not only do women attend, but when they do and when they're in an all-women space, they also raise distinctive issues. The second set of outcomes is around how did this affect the beliefs and priorities of the officers who conducted these forums and prepared policing plans to respond to these issues. So we measure these beliefs and priorities through surveys with these police officers. There was one survey that was conducted 8 months after the intervention started, so while it was ongoing, so as police are participating. The intervention ended abruptly during the pandemic, and then we collected end-line data 12 months after it ended, and that data was collected over the phone. So what I want to emphasize here is that when it came to officers' beliefs about citizens' priorities, we saw that in the CPOP-G police beats, the probability that female officers ranked gender-based violence among the top 3 priorities that they thought citizens had, that probability increased both during the intervention, and that effect persisted at the 12 months after the intervention had ended. And that's similar for male officers in CPOP-G. And this is important because male officers were not the ones who were conducting those women's forums. And so they were in the male forums where these issues were not coming up. And so if this change is happening, it's we see it as a product of the interaction that's happening between female and male officers rather than male officers learning from female citizens. And then we ask about officers' own priorities. How do they rank gender-based violence among the set of issues that's most important to address in their beat? And here we see among women officers, while the intervention is ongoing, that probability of ranking gender-based violence among their top 3 goes up. But that effect washes away and dissipates 12 months after the intervention. That's, in fact, different from male officers, where you see an increase while the intervention is ongoing, and it actually persists 12 months after the intervention. So to make sense of this, we went back and did some semi-structured interviews with officers who were part of this study. So the first thing that came up really clearly from officers' interviews was that this intervention seems to have led to greater discussion and contact and interaction between female and male officers, and that they did talk about the issues that were coming up in those forums. And then and this was true for both the female officers' reports in the interviews as well as male officers' reports. And then in terms of what changed for these male officers, right? So this is an illustrative quote of a theme that we see broadly across the interviews. One of the things that we think changed was their awareness about the true prevalence of gender-based violence. If officers are basing their views of how prevalent this is on what gets reported to the police, they're going to get it very, very wrong, right? Because this is a notoriously underreported issue. And we actually see a quote from a male officer who says, "I learned a lot about unreported cases through this program. They're quite common, but never seem to get reported." This was not true of female officers, right? So these were common issues I knew of already. And so they're interacting with this information in very different ways. And we see this as kind of a suggestive explanation for the pattern of persistence in the change in officers' priorities, right? And so for women, these issues perhaps gain salience while the intervention is ongoing. But it doesn't really change their underlying beliefs or information. Whereas for men, there seems to be a real updating that's happening. And there's interesting work in political psychology that looks at the persistence of informational effects, where it is higher for when the information is new. And so that's kind of a plausible explanation for what's going on. In this study, I think it's pretty clear how gender norms of segregation shaped the implementation of the intervention and the outcomes, but also what was left unchanged or possibly reinforced. In this case, there were several interesting quotes from female officers that talked about the way male officers played a protective role during the course of this intervention. So, for instance, a female officer here says, "The existence of male staff makes the female staff feel more secure. If a female member is alone, she does not feel as safe as she does with a male member, which is why my experience of working together was very useful and advantageous." So, in a way, this intervention may have actually reinforced male protective norms by having female officers go and do a task that they would not otherwise do, but accompanied by their male colleagues. Suggestively, we can also think about, this did not come up in the male interviews, but we may think that one of the reasons they were amenable to updating and receiving this information from female officers is because it's in the context of them retaining this sort of hierarchical protective role vis-a-vis their female colleagues. Even though we see them doing the same task, and so, at some level it's task-based integration, but it's in a way that allows and even reinforces male officers' unique protective role vis-a-vis female officers. So it's not a challenge to their authority. In some ways, it may even be reinforcing it. So just to conclude, I think across both of these studies, what we did see is that these norm-neutral interventions that don't account for norms like norms of male gatekeeping, simply targeting women and thinking it's going to work to change their voting behavior, designing a community-based intervention that doesn't have mandated inclusion criteria. Those are things that fail to achieve change even on those target indicators. And those modified designs that take the status quo of norms into account, so the targeting men with the canvassing campaign, having mandated criteria for women's inclusion, creating socially appropriate space for women's separate participation, they actually succeed to some level on changing these target indicators. But they potentially reinforce gender norms or leave them unchanged in other domains, which are not captured by these indicators. And so I think, both of these studies sort of speak to a much broader question of the different ways in which short-term policy intervention interacts with gender norms. So gender norms are more than just the context in which those policy interventions take place. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. We're actually going to try something new today. We're going to have a mic for our Q&A also, so that folks who are with us online can hear the questions and not just Professor Khan's answers. So with that said, I'll pass you the mic, and you can then hand it back to me.
This was Absolutely. Is it on? No. Oh, you can hear me? This was fascinating, and I have so many questions. But I'll just raise one for now. Again, thank you for this research. It's very, very generative. I'm thinking about the first study and about the that final panel you showed us with the 6 different questions, the follow-up questions, and about the norms for and the, I guess, ultimately not that surprising finding that when norms are not violated, it was only when norms were not violated that there was actually encouragement of this political participation. So, but I was wondering if there was any difference, if you did in the study any kind of controlling for class. And so I was thinking about just some surprising finding from my own work in Mumbai, that actually political participation was, like, the norms for women's political participation was often much higher in lower income communities. And in fact, sort of, visibility in public space much higher in low income communities, whereas more affluent. So is it the case that political participation for women is sort of more normal among the working classes than it is for the more affluent, who might, where sort of respectability might be gendered in a particular kind of way? I don't know if that's something you looked at, but I was very curious.
Should I answer? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, I think that this question is really interesting, also because I think it's a different way of thinking about the relationship between, say, income and participation, because the resource-based models of political participation sort of think of, well, if you have greater resources, that allows you more access to information, and so higher resources, higher participation, and of course, just generally work from the global south upends that, where you see higher participation both by men and women in a lower income strata. I think when it comes to this study, we don't have enough variation to see differences by class. So we have differences by income, but it's all kind of lower middle class, working class individuals. And so we don't have the very poor, and we also don't have the affluent. And that's in part of how we kind of sampled within wards, and don't have kind of informal settlements or slums as part of the sample, and we also don't have the very high income areas, which are notoriously low survey response areas, and so we're not able to answer that with this data, unfortunately.
One thing I'll just add for anyone online, we do have access to the chat, so if anyone would like to chat in a question, we can pass that along in just a minute. But until then.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have one question for both the studies. Two questions in total. So for the first study, I'm wondering, conceptually speaking, have you thought about differentiating between participation and contestation? Because participation might be routinized. That's also one explanation for why a lot of developing countries might have better even turnout rates. So in terms of that, conceptually, how would you differentiate? Second question for the lack of not lasting, the effect not lasting. So the female police officers are interacting with the male officers, yes, but there is another interaction that they might be having with the women who are coming into these open forums. So is it possible, like, say, in other village panchayats that happen, say, in other parts in India, village panchayats, village forums also reinforce the same social norms, same social hierarchies that they might be getting exposed to through this open forum, and that might be reinforcing?
So thank you for those questions. I think this differentiation between participation and contestation, how participation might be routinized, is really interesting, and I think that perhaps the way I have started to think about that is less directly with this study and more around the descriptive pattern that I showed in the beginning, where turnout is kind of paradoxically lower in urban areas, right? And so there's a way in which participation in rural areas is mobilized in large blocks by political parties. And even though women aren't part of those negotiations around which candidate a bloc is going to support, a bloc includes kind of women as part of that voting bloc. And so there's communities that are voting together, and women are brought along in a way. Whereas in urban areas, you see the kind of individualization of voting, both for men and for women. And so turnout rates are lower for both men and women, but the gender gap is actually still even higher for women. And so what's happening there is that political parties are doing some of this door-to-door canvassing, and that is actually leaving women out as well, because it's often a job that's done by male party workers. And so when it's individualized, women are less likely to be reached. When they do vote, we have like very limited data on this, but it seems like their decision on who to vote for is more of an individual one, where they say, I decide on my own, versus in rural areas, it's more that I decide along with my family. So in terms of how routinized the decision is, I think there's potentially an urban-rural difference around it, and we see it reflected in turnout rates. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I'm happy to. I'd be curious to see what you're thinking of in terms of contestation as well. On the lack of persistence for women, so if I understand your question correctly, it's about whether that absence of these issues from open forums is potentially reinforced in other types of village meetings or forums that might be taking place. Did I get you right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, so I think that in this case, for the women who are coming to these forums, they're being held literally in parallel with, so at the same time as the open forum. So it's just that women have a different space to go to that's convened by a female officer. And so they're still kind of generally coming along with a male member of the household. Not always. We also have there's interesting quotes from female officers who said, oh, at this forum there was a number of domestic workers who came and they raised all of these issues with their employers. So it's not the whole story, but oftentimes, and there'll always be women who are outside of those norms, right? And women who work tend to be. And many of them are coming accompanied by men to the site and then going off into the women's only forum. And so it's not really subverting norms of mobility and participation in public space.
I think this is really, both of these studies are really cool and have really interesting implications. And I'm wondering what you're thinking this means for candidate strategy, particularly female candidates, because we like to sort of think about in this sort of descriptive substantive representation work, right? That women are, trying to reach other women and trying to understand what issues are salient for other women. But what this sort of suggests to me anyway is that female candidates might perhaps do better to try to reach out to the men in the household, and just because of the ways in which information ends up sort of traveling. And so I'm wondering, um, you know, whether it's, political parties, and you spoke a little bit about this in terms of sort of the rural community dynamic in terms of mobilization. But do you think that this sort of would have an impact on a so this was a nonpartisan canvassing intervention on one that would be much more kind of traditional in terms of a particular party or candidate?
Yeah. This is that's a great question, and I think we have. So one of the things we did while designing this study was that there was a by-election in one of the constituencies in Lahore before the 2018 election, and there were two female candidates running. And so we shadowed them a little bit to see, well, what does this, this should be the best case scenario. What is it in terms of candidates trying to mobilize women? What does it look like? And we did see that they had female party workers accompanying them as they went around neighborhoods, and so there's work also from India showing that female candidates rely on other women party workers more so than male candidates do, and so they bring in women into the party structure, and so we saw a little bit of that, but their ways of reaching out to women were actually pretty paternalistic, and so it wasn't let me learn about your issues. It was kind of focused on voter education, and so it was actually more similar to the nonpartisan like voter education efforts, saying, oh, like women don't come out, you should come out, you should vote. And so it's kind of interesting because those are two different things, and while targeting men might get women to turn out and like solve some of that constraint, I'm less sure about what it does for like persuasion on who to vote for, right? And so I think that is something where there's an opportunity in urban areas in a way that there isn't in rural areas where you have these voting blocks where families are voting together. So if a candidate wanted to, they could mobilize women as a constituency. We're not seeing that happen, to be very clear. What we did hear from women in focus groups was that there's an appetite for this, where they really, we have these very powerful quotes about how they feel invisible to candidates. And so they said, well, nobody comes and talks to us. Even if the candidate's wife had come to talk to us, that would be something. And so there's kind of a missed opportunity for candidates to mobilize women here that they're not picking up on. And I think, I'm not sure why that is. I have some thoughts, but yeah, thank you for the question.
Great. Okay, I see 3 hands. Maybe in the interest of time, we go 1, 2, 3, and everyone asks their individual question, and then sorry, you can respond.
Sarah, thank you so much for this presentation. We're so glad to have you here. I have 2 questions about the first paper. The first one, what if someone came to you with just a real blunt interpretation of the findings and said, this is not worth it to do outreach to women? Like, how would you think about engaging with that person? And then the second question relates to the finding that men and women kind of see, men more, that participation beyond voting is not appropriate for women. So I'm wondering if there's circulation of ideas about politics being dirty, politics being bad, politics being a man's game. Are those conversations going on? I'm thinking about my own experience of politics is bad in Mali, but it sounds like maybe I'm wondering if that is the case in Pakistan.
I was wondering if there was any trends you saw with increase in women participating in voting based on access to either social media or phones or televisions with time. And then the second thing I was curious about was whether a woman candidate like, say, Benazir Bhutto received a greater turnout, or Imran Khan, I guess, won in 2018, whether his celebrity helped, a greater turnout.
Thanks so much. And So my question is like, since Pakistan establishment, there's no elected ruler kind of completed its term, and do you think that this kind of affects the turnout, especially among the women? And also regarding the tendency towards women participation in politics, it's kind of something that I'm working currently on Afghanistan, and I was curious, like, have you looked into people's kind of demographics, whether like literate people kind of have those tendencies or illiterate people? And also, have you followed like the religious leaders' perspectives on that, since it kind of affects it? Thanks so much.
Okay, you have lots to chew on there, and so take the time that you need, and then afterwards, I'm sure that Sarah can be available for individual follow-up questions.
How much time do I have?
7-ish minutes.
Perfect. All right. Great. So, thank you for all those fantastic questions. Catherine, this provocative question of whether it's just not worth it to reach out to women, right? And is that kind of the takeaway from this? And I mean, I think what's sort of difficult about this is that we didn't see that intervention increase women's knowledge or interest or self-efficacy, right? So I have an interpretation for why it didn't increase their knowledge, because actually their baseline levels of knowledge were not that low. And so there was a gender gap, but it wasn't quite as stark. So there was another study in 2008 in rural Sindh, which was a voter education program directly targeting women, where it was, similar voter education material. And that was largely to women who were not literate and they had not completed primary education. And there they see that it actually does increase women's turnout. So it's possible that when levels of those basic, some of those things are necessary, and when those levels are, when there's gender gaps in those things, reaching out to women addressing those things is important to close those gaps. I think it's also, this goes back to the earlier question about what can parties and candidates glean from this. And I think that's different, right? And so there might be gains from reaching out to women on persuasion for a particular can't be picked up in this type of intervention. This question about politics being dirty, because asking people to three words describe politics. And my research assistant, who was cleaning the data, was too embarrassed to say out the words. Because they were largely swear words, and so I cannot present them here today. But this is so real, right? So there is a sense of politics being this, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that and this is both men and women using these words and this language to describe politics. So there's a shared sense that politics is dirty, but that means different things for whom it is appropriate to participate for. So yes, and then so this question about your question about the trends over time. So this is where we're really limited by data. And so I mentioned that it was in 2017 that there's a change in the law that mandates the reporting of sex disaggregated turnout data. So we're very limited in our historical data on sex disaggregated historical turnout data. So it's hard to say. There's some kind of aggregate level numbers from elections in earlier elections, but nothing at the constituency or polling station level that is reliable. And so it's difficult to answer this question. And in terms of whether Imran Khan's celebrity status might have improved turnout, so this is interesting because I think we have public opinion data from Lahore about support for different political parties. And going into the 2018 election, I think we saw a lot of popular press reporting on Imran Khan's popularity, especially among urban, educated women. And we don't see that bear out in the public opinion data. If anything, there's a slightly lower support among women for the PTI. So that's what we see in Lahore. So I think, we have, we can certainly say that it's the advantage among women doesn't exist. Whether there's a disadvantage is unclear. And then I think, so this question about whether the lack of regularity of elections and that sort of causes a decrease in voter turnout or voter apathy. I think this is really important for the Pakistan case. I think, one of the things that was expected was that 2024 would have a much lower turnout than 2018 because of the compromised conditions in which it took place, right? And we see a decline, but it's not as large as people predicted. And so the turnout is actually fairly comparable to 2018. There's a decline, but it's not huge, which shows that people sort of do want to use the vote, perhaps. And I don't have data to this end, but there's work from other contexts showing that people voting is expressive. Right? And so casting a vote has become an important act in and of itself. So, that's, I think that, I don't have a clear answer on that. I think what it really does is shape the incentives of political parties, right? And so I think this goes back to the earlier question, what parties do. So there is, I think if regular elections a real opportunity for parties to mobilize women as a constituency. But that's kind of a long-term goal where a party has to kind of implement policies, build legitimacy around being kind of a particular brand itself as being, we're the party that's going to do something for women. And that takes time. And I think that this sort of irregularity of elections parties and kind of invest in that sort of longer time horizon branding of a party or mobilizing a particular constituency that's new and under mobilized. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's thank Zara one more time for just a wonderful talk. Some small tokens of our appreciation. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks to all of you for being here. We do have to clear out of the room for a class that's going to start before too long, but I'm sure that Professor Khan can stay and talk for a few minutes either here or in the hall, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.